Close your eyes for a moment and listen to the faint sound of the wind moving through cherry blossoms. Imagine the soft petals drifting downward, the quiet hush of dawn, and the first golden light of day spilling across the horizon. Welcome to History to Relax, the place where stories of the past unfold slowly, like brushstrokes on paper, guiding you into calm reflection and gentle rest. Tonight, we journey into the lives of young men in wartime Japan, recruits chosen as kamikaze pilots. Through their training, their letters, their final rituals, and the silent struggles of their hearts, we'll step quietly into their world. This is not a story of battle alone, but of humanity, memory, and the fragile moments that linger even at the edge of life. Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle into your chair, or lie back beneath the comfort of your blanket. Let this story carry you, gently, at its own pace. And if you find peace in these long, quiet journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Every gesture helps us grow, and ensures these calm stories continue to reach others who need rest. So let us begin, with the stillness of dawn, and the quiet steps of boys becoming symbols, as we enter the world of the kamikaze. Part 1. The Call to Serve. The morning in wartime Japan carried a heaviness that no one could escape. Even the breeze that rustled through rice fields seemed to carry whispers of the struggle unfolding across the seas. For the young men who stood on the edge of adulthood, each day brought reminders that their future was not their own. The emperor called, the nation demanded, and family expectations pressed down like a weight upon their shoulders. To live in Japan during those years was to feel every heartbeat tied to the war. In the villages, elders gathered outside small shops, reading aloud the bold headlines from newspapers pinned to wooden boards. Reports of victories were written in grand language, designed to fill the chest with pride. Defeats were veiled in phrases that spoke of glorious sacrifice or temporary withdrawal. Children sang patriotic songs in classrooms, their voices rising in unison, while teachers reminded them that to die for one's country was the highest honor a person could achieve. On street corners, posters shouted the same message in brushstrokes thick with urgency. A plane diving toward a warship, a young man smiling beneath the white headband of resolve, slogans promising immortality for those who embraced death willingly. Even the home was touched by this presence. Mothers folded laundry with radios murmuring in the background, filling kitchens with the voices of announcers who praised the courage of soldiers. Fathers encouraged their sons with quiet pride, telling them that their bloodline would be remembered through sacrifice. When the letter of summons finally arrived, it did not always surprise. Some young men had dreamed of this moment for years, their heads filled with stories of daring pilots who carved their names into the skies. Others, however, felt a cold stillness run through them as they unfolded the paper. To be called was an honor, yes, but it was also the closing of doors they had barely begun to open. The farewell ceremonies were both beautiful and heavy. Families stood together, bowing deeply, offering words of encouragement while fighting back tears. A father's hand rested firmly on his son's shoulder, steady and unshaking, while a mother's hands trembled as she passed a carefully wrapped bundle of rice cakes. Neighbors came to see the young man off, their nods filled with unspoken expectations. The atmosphere carried both pride and sorrow, woven so tightly together that neither could be separated. Training began with the body. Before a recruit could touch the controls of an aircraft, he was broken down through endless drills. Running until the legs gave out, crawling through mud, lifting until the arms no longer obeyed. The instructors shouted without pause, their words designed to hammer away at hesitation. Each order, each punishment, was meant to erase the thought of self and replace it with complete obedience. Meals were simple and brief. Rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, sometimes a small portion of fish. Hunger became a constant companion, another tool to sharpen resolve. At night, in the barracks lined with straw mats, the recruits lay in silence, bodies aching, minds replaying the words shouted at them during the day. Your body is no longer yours. Your life belongs to the Emperor. Classroom lessons were equally relentless. Charts of aircraft parts, diagrams of enemy ships, maps of the Pacific covered the walls. Instructors spoke with sharp precision, drilling into the recruits the knowledge they would need to strike with efficiency. Between technical lectures, they were shown films filled with stirring music and images of soldiers smiling before battle. The message was repeated so often that it became a rhythm in the blood. To die in service was not death at all, but transformation. Yet despite the constant hammering of discipline, the quiet moments still belonged to the young men themselves. In the stillness after lights out, whispers floated through the barracks. Jokes about the stern expressions of their instructors, murmurs of homesickness, fragments of songs hummed to ease the tension. Laughter came in soft bursts, quickly hushed, as though the sound itself was dangerous. Letters became lifelines. By candlelight or in the dim glow of an oil lamp, recruits wrote carefully on small sheets of paper. They described training routines, always with a tone of reassurance. The food is good, the instructors are kind, I am learning quickly. Between the lines, however, sat all the things they did not dare write. The exhaustion that left their bodies trembling, the sudden pang of longing for home, the unspoken fear of what the future demanded. For many, the memory of family guided them through the endless days. A sister's laughter, a mother's warm hand, the sound of wind moving through the fields near home. These recollections flickered in their minds during long marches or when the hum of engines filled the air. They were reminders of the world beyond the uniform, the reason for enduring the harshness of training. The instructors understood this as well. They did not forbid thoughts of family. Instead, they shaped them. Think of your mother, they would say. How proud she will be when you offer your life for her safety. Think of your father, who gave you his strength so that you could protect this land. Think of your ancestors, who watch from the heavens, waiting for you to join their eternal company. The personal and the national were woven together until they seemed inseparable. As the weeks turned to months, the recruits grew leaner, harder, more accustomed to the rhythm of discipline. Their movements became sharp, their eyes focused. Yet beneath the surface, each carried the knowledge that this path was not like others. To be a pilot in those days was not only to fly but to be prepared, at any moment, to give all. And so the call to serve was not a single moment but a journey. It began with the letter, carried through the ceremonies, and deepened with each step of training. By the time a recruit first touched the controls of a plane, he had already been reshaped. His body no longer felt like his own. His thoughts had been steered toward a destiny larger than himself. The horizon stretched wide before him, but in his heart, he knew that the sky he trained to master might also be the sky in which his life would end. Still, there was pride. Pride in the uniform, in the sense of belonging to something greater, in the honor of defending one's nation. For many, this pride was genuine, not simply planted by words of propaganda but felt deeply in their bones. They wanted to protect their families, their neighbors, their homeland. They wanted to believe that their sacrifice would mean safety for the people they loved. But late at night, when the voices quieted and the barracks grew still, other feelings stirred. What did it mean to walk a path where the end was already decided? What dreams would remain forever unfulfilled? These questions lingered like smoke, faint yet impossible to fully disperse. They would remain, following each young man as he moved closer to the day when training would end, and the true call of service would begin. Part 2. entering the Air Corps. The first step inside the gates of the Air Corps training school was like crossing into another world. The outside carried the smells of the village and the murmurs of ordinary life, but inside the compound, everything seemed stripped down to a single purpose. Rows of barracks stretched in straight lines across the ground. Parade squares shimmered in the sun. The constant echo of voices, shouting orders, chanting responses, the rhythmic stomp of boots, filled the air like a drumbeat. It was here that young men shed the last fragments of civilian life and became part of a machine that promised both glory and death. For many recruits, the initial days were overwhelming. They arrived carrying bundles from their families, clothes, notebooks, small tokens of home, only to be told to set them aside. Personal items were discouraged. The instructors reminded them that individuality was a weakness. A recruit's heart must beat in rhythm with the Corps, his thoughts aligned with those of his comrades, his body indistinguishable from the group. Even the way they walked, the way they bowed, the way they ate meals was scrutinized until it reflected uniformity. The first nights in the barracks were restless. Dozens of young men, some barely 17, others only a little older, lay side by side on straw mats, the smell of sweat and dust heavy in the air. They whispered to one another, tentative at first, then with growing familiarity. Questions about home, about the drills, about the instructors' sharp tempers, filled the spaces between the snores and coughs. In those early days, friendships were born out of shared fatigue. One could endure the endless shouting better when a companion offered a crooked smile or a whispered joke. Each morning began before dawn. The sound of a whistle cut through the barracks, pulling everyone from thin blankets and onto their feet. Within moments, they were outside, lined in perfect rows, shivering in the early chill. The sun rose slowly as they ran, sometimes for hours, the rhythm of their footsteps echoing against the training grounds. It was exhausting, but exhaustion was the point. Instructors reminded them that a pilot must never show weakness. Weakness was death, not only for oneself but for the entire mission. After physical drills, the recruits sat in classrooms where the scent of chalk dust and ink replaced that of sweat. They studied maps with careful attention, tracing coastlines, memorizing distances, learning the locations of enemy bases and naval routes. They learned to identify silhouettes of ships and aircraft in an instant, taught that hesitation could cost victory. Technical manuals filled their desks, dense with diagrams of engines, instruments, and wings. The instructors demanded complete focus, punishing even the smallest lapse in attention. Between these technical lessons, ideology was woven like a thread. The words of the emperor were read aloud, his presence invoked as though he stood in the room with them. Officers spoke with solemn voices about the divine mission of Japan, reminding the recruits that their country was chosen by the gods to lead Asia into a new future. They were told that their generation had the honor of proving this destiny with their lives. The message was simple, repeated until it sank into the bones. The individual was nothing, the nation was everything. Still, beneath the rigid discipline, glimpses of youth emerged. At mealtime, bowls of rice clattered on trays, laughter sometimes rising above the hum of voices. A recruit might share a story from his village, another might mimic the way an instructor barked commands, earning muffled chuckles. In stolen moments, they were not soldiers, but boys who had been caught too soon in the tide of war. The first encounters with aircraft were unforgettable. Long before they were allowed to fly, recruits stood in hangars where the smell of oil, metal, and gasoline filled the air. They ran their hands over the smooth surfaces of wings, felt the cool steel of the fuselage, listened to the roar of engines that seemed to shake the earth itself. To many, it was intoxicating. The machine was both beautiful and terrible, a promise of freedom and a reminder of mortality. Some spoke of it with awe, as though touching the aircraft connected them to something larger than life. When the time came for flight training, the nervous excitement was palpable. Instructors climbed into the cockpits with them, guiding their hands, correcting every mistake with sharp words or a quick slap to the shoulder. The controls felt heavy at first, the sky vast and overwhelming, but with each attempt the recruits grew steadier. The sensation of rising above the ground, of leaving the earth behind, carried with it both exhilaration and dread. They knew, even in those first moments of flight, that the sky could just as easily embrace them as claim their lives. Letters home continued during these months. They described the thrill of flying, though always tempered with reassurances. I am safe. I am strong. I will make you proud. For every line of encouragement, there were thoughts left unsaid. The fear of failure, the doubt that crept in when engines sputtered, the ache of longing when a familiar scent drifted into memory, these stayed hidden, locked within the heart. Instructors encouraged recruits to imagine their families as they trained, but always through the lens of duty. Fly for your mother, they said. Fly for your father. Fly for your ancestors. In this way, personal love was reshaped into fuel for sacrifice. The recruits clung to those words, half believing, half struggling, their emotions pulled in two directions at once. As months passed, the recruits grew leaner, sharper, their faces lined with determination. They marched in unison, their eyes carried the same fire, their bodies moved as though controlled by a single will. The Air Corps had reshaped them. Where once there were boys with individual dreams, now stood soldiers ready to follow orders without hesitation. And yet, late at night, when silence returned to the barracks, each one still carried private thoughts that no discipline could erase. Dreams of home, of fields and rivers, of mothers and sisters, of laughter under summer skies. These lived quietly within them, like embers refusing to die. They did not speak of these dreams aloud, but the dreams gave them strength even as they surrendered themselves to the rhythm of service. In this way, the journey into the Air Corps was not only a passage of training but a transformation of spirit. The recruits had entered as sons, brothers, students. They emerged as instruments of war, bound to an uncertain future in the sky. The call to serve had brought them here, and now the Air Corps shaped them into men whose destiny was no longer their own. Part 3. The Drill Ground. The drill ground was where the real transformation of body and spirit took place. If the classroom filled the mind with knowledge and the barracks shaped discipline, then the open square under the unforgiving sky carved obedience into flesh. It was here that recruits learned what it meant to surrender themselves entirely to the will of the Air Corps. The ground itself was hard, dusty in summer and slick with mud in the rainy season. Rows of young men lined its edges, their uniforms pressed but quickly soiled by the demands of the day. At the sharp call of an instructor's whistle, they moved into formation. Every step meant to be identical, every shout of response meant to rise as one. The sound was deafening, the stomp of boots against earth, the bark of voices that merged into a single wave of sound, the quick echo of commands snapping through the air like the crack of whips. Marching was the first lesson, repeated until muscles ached and blisters formed on raw heels. Left, right, forward, halt. The rhythm seemed endless, stretching from sunrise into the heat of noon. Mistakes were not tolerated. A recruit who stumbled or faltered threw off the harmony of the unit, and for that, the entire group paid the price. Punishment was swift. More drills, more running, sometimes the sting of a wooden staff against a back or leg. Pain was not merely consequence but teaching, a reminder that one man's hesitation could destroy the mission of all. Beyond marching, the recruits were driven into exercises that tested endurance. Long runs circled the perimeter of the grounds, lungs burning, legs heavy as lead. Crawling through mud became routine, the grit clinging to skin, filling mouths and eyes until the world blurred. Push-ups continued until arms trembled uncontrollably, sit-ups until stomachs cramped, all under the watchful gaze of instructors who never seemed to tire. The human body was pressed to its limit, then pressed further still, until recruits discovered that limits were illusions to be broken. The instructors carried themselves with an unyielding air. Their voices were sharp as steel, their eyes always scanning for weakness. They walked the rows with deliberate slowness, stopping suddenly to hurl an insult or strike a careless posture into correction. There was no space for softness here. Every moment on the drill ground was designed to strip away hesitation, to harden the will, to make reflex replace thought. Yet there was more than physical training at work. The drill ground was a theater of ideology. Between commands, instructors reminded the recruits why they endured such pain. The body you break now will not be yours to lose later. It belongs to the Emperor. It belongs to Japan. These words, spoken day after day, became as familiar as the beat of their hearts. The repetition carved belief into them with the same precision that drills carved endurance. Despite the harshness, bonds of camaraderie deepened on the ground. When one recruit faltered, another quietly offered strength. A whispered word of encouragement, a steadying hand during a run, the simple presence of someone struggling beside you, all became sources of quiet endurance. The instructors could command obedience, but they could not erase the human impulse to look out for one another. These shared trials built friendships forged in exhaustion and pain, friendships that felt unshakable beneath the weight of the uniform. Food breaks were brief, almost ritual. Bowls of rice handed out quickly, miso soup slurped in silence, pickled vegetables crunched between teeth. Conversation was limited, but the glances exchanged over meals spoke volumes. A nod of recognition for surviving the morning's trials, a faint smile when a neighbor's hand shook too much to hold chopstick steady. These tiny gestures became lifelines, reminders that one was not suffering alone. As the weeks passed, the drill ground reshaped the men. Postures straightened, voices grew stronger, movements sharpened into reflex. Where once there had been students, clerks, or farmers' sons, now stood soldiers who moved as one. Their individuality faded, replaced by the rhythm of the corps. They no longer thought about where to place their feet. Their bodies knew instinctively. They no longer hesitated when commands rang out. Obedience had become as natural as breath. Still, in the quiet moments after drills, when sweat dried on skin and muscles throbbed with fatigue, private thoughts returned. The scent of earth after rain reminded someone of home fields. The sting of blisters recalled a mother's hands, once gentle on a child's feet. The taste of simple rice carried echoes of family kitchens. These moments were fleeting, quickly swallowed by the next command, but they lingered in the heart as reminders of the world beyond the drill ground. Punishments grew harsher for those who resisted, even in silence. A recruit who showed weakness was singled out, made to stand before his comrades as an example. Shame weighed heavier than bruises, for in a culture that prized honor above all, disgrace was worse than pain. To fail on the drill ground was not only to fail oneself, but to stain the pride of family and village. This fear pressed them forward as much as the barked commands of their instructors. At night, when the drills ended and lanterns flickered in the barracks, conversations often returned to the day's trials. Some laughed, comparing the ridiculous postures they had been forced into, finding humor in exhaustion. Others remained silent, staring at the ceiling, minds drifting toward thoughts unspoken. Each man carried the same knowledge, though none said it aloud. All of this was preparation not just for flying but for dying. The drill ground was teaching them to meet death without hesitation. And yet, paradoxically, The very harshness of the drill created moments of beauty. The synchronized sound of 100 boots striking earth together, the sudden silence of perfect stillness after a shouted halt, the glint of sunlight on polished helmets, all combined to create a spectacle that stirred something deep within. For a fleeting moment, the recruits felt part of something larger, something eternal. It was in these moments that the exhaustion seemed worth it, the pain seemed purposeful, the loss of self seemed almost noble. By the time months had passed, the drill ground had left its mark. Shoulders grew broader, eyes sharper, voices steadier. The young men had been carved into soldiers who no longer flinched at pain, who no longer questioned orders, who no longer thought first of themselves. The transformation was not complete, but it was well underway. The drill ground had prepared them to follow commands without hesitation, to endure without complaint, to accept that their lives were already promised to the sky. In the quiet of their hearts, each recruit still carried private fears and hidden dreams. But the drill ground ensured those fears would never reach the surface. The body obeyed even when the heart trembled. The voice shouted in unison even when the mind whispered doubt. And in this way, the young men moved one step closer to the destiny waiting for them beyond the walls of the training ground. Part 4. In the classroom. The classroom at the Air Corps School was not an escape from the hardships of the drill ground. It was another battlefield, one where the weapon was memory, focus, and discipline of the mind. Rows of wooden desks filled the long hall, each one occupied by a recruit sitting with perfect posture, notebooks squared neatly, pencils sharpened to fine points. The room smelled of ink, chalk, and the faint tang of oil carried in from the nearby hangars. Windows were always propped open, though the air that drifted through carried little relief. Whether in the sweltering heat of summer or the biting cold of winter, the classroom remained a place of unyielding demands. The day often began with lectures on aerodynamics, the instructors' voices echoing against bare walls as they explained the principles of lift and drag, thrust and resistance. Charts were unrolled and pinned to boards, filled with diagrams of wings and propellers. The recruits copied every detail carefully, their hands moving quickly across paper, terrified of missing a single point. A forgotten note, a misplaced equation, could bring punishment as swift and sharp as on the drill ground. For knowledge, like discipline, was to be absorbed without error. Next came the study of engines. Large diagrams of aircraft engines were hung at the front, the intricate details of pistons, carburetors, and fuel lines traced by the instructor's pointer. Recruits learned to identify each part, to understand how air mixed with fuel, how power surged through mechanical veins, how even the smallest malfunction could mean disaster in the sky. Their notebooks filled with sketches, arrows pointing to valves and gears, annotations in neat script that had to be memorized as faithfully as scripture. But the classroom was not only technical. Woven between lessons on mechanics and navigation were sessions devoted to ideology. An officer, often dressed more formally than the others, would step to the front of the room and speak not of engines but of spirit. The recruits were reminded of their place in history, told that Japan's mission was divine, its emperor a living god, its soldiers chosen instruments of destiny. The words carried weight not only because of their authority but because of their repetition. Morning after morning, week after week, the message pressed deeper into the mind until it echoed there without effort. Maps became familiar companions. Large ones hung on walls, their surfaces covered with pins and markings showing the vast Pacific, dotted with islands that seemed small yet carried enormous significance. The recruits traced coastlines with their eyes, memorizing distances between bases, learning the paths of shipping routes, studying the silhouettes of enemy battleships. They were told that hesitation in recognition could cost precious seconds, and precious seconds could mean failure. Soon, even from a glance, A recruit could identify the outline of an American carrier or the shape of a British destroyer. The ability was drilled until it became instinct. Silence in the classroom was absolute. The scratching of pencils, the occasional cough, the sound of pages turning. These were the only noises permitted beyond the instructor's voice. To speak out of turn was unthinkable. To let one's gaze wander from the board was to invite sharp rebuke. Some instructors carried wooden rods, tapping them against desks when attention wavered. Others relied on the heavy silence itself, letting the weight of their presence press down until every spine sat straighter. Despite the severity, the recruits found moments of quiet fascination. There was wonder in the elegance of flight, in the mathematics that explained how a heavy machine could rise into the sky, in the precision of instruments that measured altitude and speed. For many, it was their first glimpse into the hidden science behind the miracle of flying. The equations, the diagrams, the charts, these became not only lessons but symbols of the new world they were entering. During breaks, conversations whispered across desks. Recruits compared notes, corrected one another's sketches, shared small details from home. A boy from Hokkaido might describe the wide fields he left behind, while another from Osaka spoke of the bustle of city streets. The classroom, for all its sternness, still held traces of youth. A crooked smile, a quietly traded sweet, a doodle drawn in the margin of a notebook. These were acts of resistance as gentle as they were fleeting. Letters continued to flow in and out during these months. A mother's words of encouragement, written in brushstrokes soft and careful, were tucked into notebooks, read again and again during quiet moments. Recruits responded with formal, restrained language, assuring their families of good health, of steady progress, of unshakable pride. The harsher realities of exhaustion, the constant fear of failure, the creeping awareness of what might lie ahead, those details were carefully left out. Families received words designed to comfort, never words that might worry. Evenings in the classroom often ended with study sessions under dim lantern light. The recruits bent over their notes, eyes straining, lips moving silently as they repeated lessons to themselves. Fatigue pressed heavily, but failure was unthinkable. To fall behind meant shame, not only personal but collective, a stain upon the reputation of one's family and village. Pride and duty drove the pencil across the page long after the body begged for rest. And yet, beneath all the repetition and silence, thoughts sometimes strayed. The young men wondered what their future flights would be like. Would they feel fear in the cockpit? Would they remember all these diagrams when engines roared around them? Some looked out the windows at the darkening sky and felt both longing and dread. The stars above promised beauty and vastness, but they also promised a battlefield. The classroom was a crucible of the mind. It demanded memory, obedience, and unflinching concentration. It stripped away distraction and replaced it with precision. But it also carried a strange duality. On one hand, it filled the recruits with knowledge that made them capable pilots. On the other, it filled them with words and images that prepared them to accept death as inevitable. By the time they closed their notebooks each night, they had learned not only how to fly but why they must be ready to never return. When they stepped out of the classroom into the cool air of evening, their heads buzzed with equations and maps, with engines and instruments, with slogans and commands. They walked back to the barracks in silence, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots the only sound, each one lost in the balance between knowledge and surrender. The classroom had shaped them as surely as the drill ground. It had sharpened their minds into tools, just as the drills had sharpened their bodies. Together, these worlds of sweat and ink moved them closer to the destiny that waited in the skies. Part 5. First Flight. The day of the first flight was one every recruit carried in his mind from the moment he entered training. All the drills, All the classroom lessons, all the punishments and the long nights of memorization pointed toward this singular experience: to leave the earth behind and rise into the sky. It was not only a test of skill, but of spirit. For many, it was the moment when the reality of their future finally took shape. The morning began earlier than usual. The recruits woke to the sound of whistles, pulled on freshly cleaned uniforms, and marched toward the hangars with a nervous energy that filled the air. The rising sun cast a golden light across the airfield, glinting off the wings of the planes lined up in careful rows. Engines already rumbled in the distance, their low growl vibrating through the ground, filling the chest with both excitement and unease. The aircraft for training were smaller than the ones shown on propaganda posters. They were not sleek war machines, but sturdy trainers built for endurance and repetition. Yet to the recruits, they seemed magnificent. Each bolt, each rivet, each polished surface gleamed with significance. The smell of oil and gasoline clung to the air, mixing with the dust stirred by boots on the runway. The scene imprinted itself into memory, an image that would remain vivid even decades later for those who survived the war. Before climbing into the cockpit, recruits stood in lines as instructors gave final instructions. Voices cut sharp against the roar of engines, reminding them of procedures, of discipline, of the duty they carried. Safety was mentioned, but always secondary to obedience. A mistake in the air was not only dangerous, it was shameful. The recruits bowed deeply, acknowledging the words, though their hearts beat wildly in their chests. Climbing into the cockpit was like stepping into another world. The seat was cramped, the metal frame cool beneath the fingers. Dials and levers surrounded them, each one a reminder of the lessons memorized in the classroom. The leather straps of the harness pulled tight across the chest, holding them in place, binding them to the machine. The canopy was open to the sky, and the smell of fuel was overwhelming, seeping into clothes and skin. An instructor often sat behind the recruit during those first flights, his voice carried through a speaking tube. He guided hands to the controls, corrected posture, reminded them to steady their breathing. The engine roared louder now, shaking the frame, rattling teeth, vibrating through bones. The world outside blurred as the plane gathered speed, wheels bouncing along the earth until, suddenly, there was no more ground. The moment of lift was unforgettable. The weight of the earth seemed to fall away as the plane rose, the field shrinking below, the barracks reduced to toy-like shapes, the world expanding in every direction. For many recruits, the first breath taken in the sky was sharper, fuller, filled with awe, yet or mixed with fear. Every movement of the controls felt heavy, uncertain. A wrong turn could send the nose dipping too far. A hesitation could make the plane shudder in protest. Instructors barked commands through the tube. Level your wings. Keep steady. Watch your altitude. The recruits obeyed as best they could, sweat dripping into their eyes, hands trembling slightly on the stick. Each correction, each adjustment, was a lesson written not in chalk but in motion, carved into the memory with the urgency of survival. The sky was not silent. The engine thundered constantly, the wind whipped against faces, the vibrations of the frame created a hum that seemed to seep into the bones. Yet within that noise, there was also a strange calm. To look out and see the horizon stretching endlessly, to watch clouds drift beneath the wings, to feel the freedom of flight, it was as though the sky opened itself in invitation. Some recruits returned from their first flight elated, their faces lit with smiles they could not hide. Others climbed down from the cockpit pale, their legs unsteady, the fear still clinging tightly to them. Yet all bowed deeply to their instructors, hiding whatever emotions surged within. To show too much joy was improper. To reveal too much fear was dangerous. The proper expression was one of calm obedience, regardless of what the heart screamed. The days that followed were filled with repetition. Takeoff, landing, sharp turns, stalls, recoveries. Each maneuver drilled again and again until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Mistakes were punished not only with harsh words but with shame before one's peers. A failed landing or a poorly executed turn was never forgotten, whispered about in the barracks at night. Yet improvement brought quiet pride, a sense that one was becoming worthy of the uniform, worthy of the destiny that lay ahead. Letters written during this stage carried a new tone. Recruits described the wonder of flight, though always with restraint. Today I saw the earth from above, and it looked like a painting, one might write. Or, the sky is larger than I imagined, but I feel strong. They assured their families that they were progressing, that they were learning quickly, that they would soon be capable of defending the nation. What they did not write was the fear that lingered with every landing, the nightmares of falling, the silent prayers whispered before each takeoff. At night, the recruits sometimes gathered near the edges of the airfield, watching as instructors demonstrated more advanced maneuvers. Loops, dives, rolls. The planes traced patterns against the fading light, movements that seemed both graceful and terrifying. The young men whispered among themselves, imagining the day when they would be asked to perform the same. Some felt anticipation, others dread, but none admitted doubt aloud. The first flight marked a turning point in the soul as well as in training. The sky was no longer an idea painted on posters or drawn in notebooks. It was a reality, vast and demanding. It welcomed them, but it also tested them, forcing them to confront not only their skills but their mortality. For in the roar of engines and the sweep of clouds, each recruit knew that this path would not end with safe landings and peaceful skies. It would end with missions where return was never expected. And yet, despite the fear, there was pride. Pride in mastering the controls, pride in wearing goggles and harness, pride in knowing that they could rise above the earth like the heroes described in newspapers and speeches. This pride gave them strength, even as it carried them further into a future that asked for everything. The first flight did not end when the wheels touched the ground again. It lived on in the trembling of hands, in the racing of the heart, in the memory of seeing the world from above for the first time. It lingered in dreams, sometimes as a vision of soaring freedom, sometimes as a nightmare of falling endlessly. It was a moment that defined them, shaping the men they were becoming. By the time the recruits returned to the barracks that evening, their bodies were drained, but their minds burned with the images of the sky. Some lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every movement of the plane, every command of the instructor, every sensation of rising above the earth. Others drifted quickly into sleep, their dreams filled with clouds and horizons. Whatever their reactions, none would ever forget the day they first took flight. The ground, the drills, the classrooms, all had prepared them for this. But nothing compared to the sky itself. And from that day forward, every step of training carried a weight of knowing that the sky was not only a place of freedom, but also the place where their destiny would be sealed. Part 6. The Waiting Rooms. The airfield was alive with constant movement, yet for the recruits there were long stretches of waiting. Between the drills, the classes, and the flights, there were hours that stretched out in the stillness of wooden rooms lined with benches. These waiting rooms became the hidden heart of training, where the young men sat together in silence or in whispers, their thoughts looping endlessly in the space between duty and fear. The rooms themselves were plain. Wooden floors, bare walls, windows that rattled when the wind pressed against them. A few posters hung crookedly, their brushstroke slogans declaring loyalty and sacrifice. A clock ticked loudly in the corner, its steady rhythm impossible to ignore. Time passed with a peculiar heaviness here, slower than outside, as if the weight of anticipation bent each minute into an hour. In the mornings, the recruits gathered with notebooks in their laps, reviewing lessons or diagrams by memory. Some muttered equations under their breath, lips barely moving. Others traced the outlines of planes in the margins of their papers, sketches repeated until the pencil wore thin. The air was filled with the faint scratching of graphite and the occasional cough, but beneath it all lingered a silence born not from discipline, but from thought. Every so often, an instructor's footsteps echoed in the hall, followed by the abrupt opening of the door. Names were called, and the chosen stood quickly, bowed, and followed orders without a word. The sound of boots on the floorboards faded down the corridor, and the room fell quiet again. Each name that left the list brought relief to some, dread to others. To be chosen for a flight or drill meant facing fear sooner. To remain in the room meant more time to wrestle with it. Conversations often began softly, carried on in low tones so as not to draw the attention of passing officers. The young men spoke of home, of harvests that might already be underway in distant villages, of siblings who would be starting school without them, of festivals they once attended with lanterns glowing and laughter ringing in the night. For a brief moment, the room transformed, filled with the warmth of memory. Yet just as quickly, the conversation would taper off, swallowed by the reality of the uniform and the walls that enclosed them. Letters were read and reread in these hours. Folds grew worn, ink smudged, paper softened by constant handling. A mother's careful script, a father's restrained words of pride, a younger sister's cheerful doodle. These became treasures more valuable than any possession. Some recruits traced the characters with their fingertips, memorizing the curves and strokes until they could close their eyes and see them in perfect clarity. Others tucked the letters deep into pockets, holding them close to the chest as if the paper itself could shield them from fear. The waiting rooms were also places of private struggle. Eyes stared at the floorboards, brows furrowed, lips pressed tightly as thoughts wandered into shadows. What did it mean to train so hard for a mission where survival was not expected? How could one balance the teachings of loyalty with the natural pull of life? These questions circled endlessly in the quiet, unanswered yet impossible to escape. Fatigue often hung over the room like a heavy curtain. Some recruits dozed with heads resting on arms, their sleep shallow and filled with uneasy dreams. Others sat upright, eyes distant, as if staring beyond the walls into futures they could not describe. Time in the waiting rooms was neither rest nor activity. It was a suspension, a pause between moments that carried the illusion of calm while concealing the tension beneath. Occasionally, laughter broke the stillness. A whispered joke about an instructor's stiff walk, a memory of something foolish from childhood, a playful jab at a comrade's handwriting. These moments were fleeting but precious. They reminded the recruits that beneath the layers of obedience and indoctrination, they were still young men, capable of humor, of joy, of life. The laughter always faded quickly, replaced once more by silence, but for a heartbeat it lightened the weight that pressed upon them. As training advanced, the waiting rooms took on a different tone. No longer just places between lessons, they became thresholds. A recruit might sit quietly for hours before being summoned for his first solo flight, his mind replaying every instruction, every diagram, every shouted correction. Others waited to hear whether they had passed or failed an evaluation, knowing that either outcome carried consequences they could not fully control. The room grew heavier with each passing week, as though it absorbed the fears and hopes of every man who sat within it. The waiting also taught patience. The recruits learned to control their breathing, to still their hands, to let their faces remain calm even when their hearts raced. The silence became a discipline in itself. It was a rehearsal for the moments yet to come, moments when calmness would be demanded in the face of chaos, when outward composure would be required even as the mind screamed. At night, When the rooms were empty and lanterns dimmed, their echoes remained. Dust clung to the benches, the clock ticked steadily, and the slogans on the walls seemed to watch silently. The recruits knew they would return again tomorrow, to sit in the same seats, to wait for names to be called, to carry their thoughts once more in silence. The waiting never ended. It simply shifted form as training deepened. The waiting rooms were more than physical spaces. They were mirrors. In their stillness, recruits confronted themselves, stripped of drills, stripped of lectures, stripped of the roar of engines. Here, they faced their own doubts, their private fears, their longing for life and their resignation to duty. And in that confrontation, they grew quieter, harder, more resigned. By the time the recruits left these rooms for the final stages of training, they carried not only the discipline of the drill ground or the knowledge of the classroom, but the patience and composure born of endless waiting. They had learned to sit in silence, to carry fear within without letting it spill outward, to accept the weight of uncertainty. The waiting rooms prepared them not with action, but with stillness. And in that stillness, each young man took one step closer to the moment when waiting would end, and the final summons would arrive. Part 7. The Letter Home. The act of writing home became one of the most profound rituals of training. For all the noise of the drill ground and the endless rhythm of study, there was a hush that came whenever recruits sat down to write to their families. In these moments, pens scratched softly across paper, lanterns glowed faintly against wooden walls, and the weight of distance between home and airfield pressed heavily upon every word. The supplies were simple: thin sheets of paper, envelopes provided by the Corps, and ink that sometimes smudged when hands shook with fatigue. Yet to the recruits, these materials were more precious than any possession. They carried within them a lifeline that stretched across mountains and seas, binding the young men to mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers they might never see again. The tone of these letters was shaped not only by the recruits' own hearts, but by expectation. They were told to reassure their families, to write with optimism, to conceal hardship. Instructors reminded them that their words must inspire pride, not worry. And so the letters became careful performances. I am healthy. Training goes well. I feel stronger each day. These lines repeated again and again, like a script memorized until it no longer needed thought. But between those lines lay truths left unsaid. A hand paused over the paper, fingers trembling slightly as the mind filled with words that could not be written. The ache of blisters, the exhaustion of endless drills, the fear that tightened the chest before each flight, all of these were swallowed, buried behind polite reassurances. What appeared on the page was calm and steady. What remained inside was storm and shadow. Some recruits found subtle ways to weave truth into their letters. A phrase about missing the sound of the family's rice fields in summer carried more weight than it seemed. A line about hoping to share another meal with parents one day revealed longing that could not be spoken outright. A drawing in the corner of a page, perhaps a flower or a mountain from home, said what words could not: I remember, I miss, I still belong. Receiving letters was an event of equal importance. When envelopes arrived from distant towns and villages, recruits clutched them with reverence. They read them again and again, tracing each brushstroke with their fingers, as though the ink itself carried the warmth of the writer's hand. A mother's script often carried gentle worry hidden behind words of encouragement. A father's handwriting was steadier, filled with restrained pride, a man's way of saying what he could not speak aloud. Younger siblings sometimes scrawled playful notes or clumsy drawings, their innocence a stark reminder of what the recruits were leaving behind. The letters were shared in whispers after lights out. One recruit might read aloud a line from his mother's encouragement. Another might show a sketch drawn by a younger brother. In those moments, the barracks softened, becoming less a place of discipline and more a space of family extended through words. Laughter and tears mingled quietly, hidden beneath blankets, quickly hushed if footsteps approached. There was also a darker awareness that accompanied these letters. Each recruit knew, though none said it aloud, that the letters they wrote might one day be their last. The thought pressed against the back of the mind with every stroke of the pen. Some began to shape their words differently, not only to reassure but to leave behind a memory. "Take care of yourself," they wrote to their mothers. "Look after the family," they wrote to their fathers. These simple lines carried the weight of farewell without ever admitting it. The instructors understood this as well. They encouraged the recruits to write often, but always reminded them to keep their letters filled with pride. "Your family must never doubt your courage," they said. "Even if your body fails, your spirit must remain unbroken in their eyes." And so the recruits balanced honesty with performance, shaping letters that carried both love and duty. Late at night, after envelopes were sealed and stacked neatly for collection, the recruits sometimes lingered with pen in hand, staring at the blank page. There were things they wanted to say but could not. Dreams of surviving, of building families, of walking once more through their villages under blooming cherry trees. These stayed locked in silence. The page remained white, the words never written, swallowed by the demands of honor and expectation. The letters became not only communication but symbols. They were proof that the recruits still belonged to something beyond the airfield, beyond the corps, beyond the path toward sacrifice. They were reminders that life continued elsewhere, seasons changing, festivals celebrated, children growing, fields harvested. For the young men in uniform, those details were as precious as air, sustaining them through the endless days of drills and lessons. And for families at home, the letters became treasures. Mothers tucked them into boxes, fathers reread them in silence by lamplight, siblings clutched them with pride. Each letter was a fragment of presence, proof that their son or brother still lived, still thought of them, still carried love even within the machinery of war. They knew the words were restrained, shaped by duty, but they read between the lines with the intuition of family, hearing what was not said, feeling what could not be written. By the time training advanced to its final stages, the act of writing home had become ritual. The recruits wrote with practiced ease, yet always with care, knowing that each word carried weight. Some letters were filled with steady reassurance. Others carried a quiet tenderness, a subtle farewell woven into lines about health and progress. All were written with the awareness that they might one day be the last voice their families would hear. The letter home was more than ink on paper. It was a bridge stretched across the distance between life and death, between duty and love, between silence and memory. In every fold, in every brushstroke, in every carefully chosen phrase, the recruits placed pieces of themselves. And though the war would demand their bodies, the letters ensured that their voices would remain, carried back to the homes and hearts they longed for most. Part 8. The Announcement. The moment every recruit feared and anticipated came not on the drill ground, nor in the classroom, nor even in the cockpit. It arrived in silence, delivered by words spoken in a small room where the air seemed to grow heavy. The announcement was not shouted like commands, nor dressed in ceremony. It was quiet, deliberate, and final. A young man was told he had been chosen for a mission from which he would not return. The summons came without warning. A name was called in the corridor. A recruit rose from his bench or his mat, bowed, and followed the officer down the hall. His comrades exchanged quick glances, some filled with pride, others with hidden dread. No one asked questions. Silence followed him out the door, broken only by the fading sound of boots against the floorboards. The chosen recruit entered a room where senior officers sat waiting. The walls were bare except for a framed portrait of the emperor, his eyes gazing down with a solemn stillness that filled the space. The officers did not waste words. They spoke directly, their tone calm but unyielding. "You have been selected," they said. "It is a great honor. You will bring glory to the emperor, to your family, and to Japan." The words were heavy, though delivered without emotion. The meaning was clear. The recruit's life was no longer his own. His future had narrowed to a single flight, a single dive, a single moment of collision that would end in fire and water. Reactions varied. Some recruits bowed deeply, voices steady as they accepted the order. Others felt their knees weaken, their mouths dry, their hearts pounding so loudly they could scarcely hear the rest of the officer's words. Yet all responded the same way, with obedience. "Hi." "Yes." The word was spoken softly but firmly, a sound of surrender wrapped in loyalty. After the announcement, the chosen recruit was dismissed to return to his comrades. His steps were slower now, his face set in careful calm. Eyes followed him as he entered the barracks or the waiting room. Some congratulated him with quiet words, others bowed respectfully, and still others avoided his gaze. For everyone knew what it meant. He was now walking a different path, one that would soon separate him from the rest. That night, the recruit often sat with pen in hand, staring at blank paper. The farewell letter was no longer a routine act of reassurance. It was the last voice he would leave behind. Each word carried the weight of finality. He wrote carefully, choosing phrases that would comfort his mother, that would honor his father, that would leave siblings with a memory of courage. The tears that sometimes blurred the ink were quickly wiped away, for the page could not reveal weakness. The days that followed the announcement were marked by a strange duality. Outwardly, the chosen recruit continued to train, to march, to eat alongside his comrades. He laughed softly at their jokes, joined in songs during evenings, kept his posture straight in the presence of instructors. But within, the world had shifted. Every sound, every sight, every sensation carried new meaning. The chirping of birds at dawn reminded him of mornings at home he would never see again. The taste of rice at mealtime became sharper, as though the tongue wanted to hold onto its memory. The laughter of his comrades was both comforting and painful, for he knew he would leave them behind. Instructors treated the chosen recruits with a mixture of sternness and respect. They praised their composure, reminded them of the honor they carried, and ensured they were prepared for the technical demands of their mission. At times, a quiet kindness emerged, an officer lingering a moment longer after giving instructions, a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, a nod that conveyed more than words. These gestures were rare, but they revealed that even hardened men felt the weight of sending boys to certain death. Among the comrades, the announcement changed relationships. Some envied the chosen, convinced that to be selected was the highest proof of loyalty. Others pitied them, whispering in hushed tones when lanterns dimmed. Most simply treated them with a quiet reverence, as though they had already crossed into another world. Conversations became softer around them, filled with respect but edged with sorrow. The chosen recruits themselves carried the knowledge in silence. Some turned inward, growing quieter each day, their eyes fixed on distances no one else could see. Others threw themselves into their duties with renewed intensity, determined to show strength until the end. A few sought laughter more often, joking louder than before, as if trying to squeeze every drop of life into the days that remained. Each man carried the burden differently, but all carried it alone. When families received the letters written after the announcement, they often did not realize what they were reading. The words were steady, filled with reassurance, filled with pride. Yet between the lines, mothers sensed a subtle farewell. Fathers read phrases that sounded too final to be casual. Sisters and brothers clutched the paper, not always understanding, but feeling the heaviness that lingered in the ink. The announcement was not only a command, it was a transformation. A boy became a symbol, a life became a sacrifice, a future became a single moment waiting in the sky. The recruit still walked among his comrades, still marched, still studied, still flew, but in his heart, he was already halfway gone. The announcement had marked him, and nothing could return him to the life he once imagined. In the end, the announcement was less about words than about silence. The silence that followed in the waiting rooms, the silence that settled in the barracks after lights out, the silence that stretched inside the chosen recruit himself. It was in that silence that he confronted his destiny, alone, carrying both fear and pride, both longing and resignation. And from that silence, he prepared to take the final steps toward the mission that would claim his life. Part 9. The Silent Struggle. The days after the announcement passed with a strange and heavy rhythm. Outwardly, little seemed to change. The chosen recruits continued to march, to study, to drill, to climb into cockpits and practice maneuvers. They ate the same rice, slept on the same mats, and bowed to the same instructors. Yet beneath the surface, everything was different. Each step carried a weight it had not carried before. Each glance at the horizon seemed longer, each breath more deliberate, each silence thicker with thought. This was the silent struggle, a battle waged not against enemy forces but within the heart. The chosen recruits knew that their lives now measured in weeks, perhaps days. They had accepted their orders with steady voices, but the human spirit does not surrender so easily. Instinct clung to life even when duty demanded its sacrifice. And so the struggle began, duty against desire, loyalty against longing, obedience against the quiet cry for survival. During the day, composure was absolute. The recruits smiled faintly at comrades' jokes, nodded firmly when instructors spoke, bowed deeply when officers passed. No one would see hesitation in their eyes. To show weakness was not only shameful, it was dangerous, for it risked undermining the faith of others. And so the mask remained in place, calm, steady, disciplined. But at night, when lanterns dimmed and the barracks grew quiet, the silence pressed heavily. Eyes stared upward into darkness, ears filled with the sound of shallow breathing, hearts pounding as if to remind them of what would soon be lost. Memories returned unbidden, childhood summers in the countryside, the scent of tatami mats at home, the laughter of friends long unseen. These recollections were both comfort and torment. Comfort, because they reminded the recruits of love. Torment, because they reminded them of what could never be returned. The letters they wrote during these days carried more weight than ever. A recruit might spend an hour shaping a single sentence, adjusting a phrase until it balanced honesty and restraint. "I am proud to serve," he would write. "Please do not worry for me." But in the curve of his handwriting lingered emotions he dared not confess: the fear of leaving his mother alone, the regret of not seeing his siblings grow, the ache of dreams cut short. Each letter became a battle in itself, every word chosen with care, every line a mixture of truth and concealment. Among comrades, the struggle was felt but rarely spoken. The chosen sat side by side with those still waiting, sharing meals, trading brief words, even laughing softly. Yet their laughter never quite reached their eyes. Their comrades knew it, though none would say it aloud. A hand rested a moment longer on a shoulder, a bowl of rice pushed forward with unspoken generosity, a song hummed quietly at night to ease the heaviness of silence. These were the ways the struggle was acknowledged without ever being named. The instructors, too, sensed it. Some hardened further, pushing the chosen recruits with even sharper words, demanding perfection as if to burn away hesitation. Others showed a subtle gentleness, pausing for a moment before turning away, offering a nod of recognition, speaking with a softness that was rare in the training grounds. They could not lift the burden, but they could acknowledge it. In their own way, they too were caught in the silent struggle, tasked with preparing boys for death, even as fathers themselves at home waited for sons to return. The silent struggle took many forms. For some, it was a tightening of the jaw, a constant holding of the body as though bracing for impact. For others, it was long gazes at the horizon, eyes fixed on clouds drifting freely across the sky. Some prayed quietly, mouthing words to gods and ancestors, seeking strength or forgiveness. Others turned inward, saying nothing, carrying their struggle deep inside where no one could reach. The body responded as well. Sleep grew restless, filled with dreams of falling, of fire, of home. Food tasted sharper, each grain of rice seeming to demand remembrance. Even small sensations became significant: the roughness of wood beneath fingers, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the sound of wind rustling through grass at the edge of the field. Life clung desperately to itself, drawing attention to every detail, as if the senses knew their time was short. Despite this inner conflict, the recruits continued to present calm obedience. They rose at dawn, marched in step, recited slogans, flew with steady hands. The mask remained unbroken. To their comrades, to their instructors, to the officers who commanded them, they appeared unshaken. Only in the private silence of the heart did the struggle rage. And in that struggle, a strange acceptance slowly grew. The human spirit cannot wrestle endlessly without seeking rest. For some, acceptance came in the form of faith, that their sacrifice would protect their families, that they would become guardians watching from beyond. For others, acceptance was resignation, a quiet surrender to inevitability. A few clung to hope, fragile though it was, that perhaps fate would intervene, that perhaps their mission would change, that perhaps they might return. But even that hope remained unspoken, buried beneath layers of discipline. The silent struggle was invisible to the world, yet it shaped everything. It was in the stillness of the waiting rooms, in the steady strokes of the pen across paper, in the way a recruit lingered for a moment longer under the evening sky. It was the quiet truth behind every bow, every smile, every word of loyalty. It was the unseen battlefield that every chosen recruit carried within, as they walked toward the day when silence would end in the roar of engines and the plunge into destiny. Part 10. The Ritual of Departure. The moment of departure did not arrive suddenly. It was shaped through ritual, step by step, until the chosen recruits no longer belonged to the world of the living but to the realm of memory and legend. These rituals carried the weight of centuries, blending military order with ancient tradition, turning ordinary boys into symbols of sacrifice. The preparations began quietly. An officer called the chosen recruits together in a hall lit with paper lanterns, the air heavy with incense. The floor was polished, the walls bare except for the portrait of the emperor that gazed down upon them. The atmosphere was solemn but not sorrowful. It carried a stillness that demanded reverence. Each man received a white headband marked with the red circle of the rising sun. The cloth was tied carefully, pulled tight against the forehead, the knot fixed firmly at the back. This headband was more than decoration. It was a symbol of purity, of resolve, of the spirit that must not falter. To wear it was to declare that one's body and soul were already dedicated to the final mission. Next came the sharing of sake. Small cups of clear rice wine were passed down the line, each one filled only half, so that no hand trembled under its weight. The men lifted the cups together, bowed deeply, and drank in unison. The taste was sharp, warming the throat, filling the chest with a brief fire. This was not a toast to life. but to death. It was the farewell of warriors, binding them together as brothers one last time. Afterward, they received short ceremonial speeches. Instructors spoke of loyalty, of the Emperor's divine mission, of the eternal glory awaiting those who fell in service. The words were familiar, heard countless times during training, yet now they carried new weight. They were no longer abstractions, but promises tied directly to the lives of the men who stood listening. Each syllable seemed carved into the air, heavy, final, inescapable. Some rituals reached deeper into personal tradition. A recruit might receive a small charm from a Shinto priest, a folded paper talisman meant to protect his spirit as he crossed into death. Another might carry a lock of hair tied carefully with thread, given by a mother before he left home. A few carried photographs of family, tucked carefully inside uniforms where they would rest against the heart until the end. These small tokens were hidden from view but held with fierce devotion, reminders that even as symbols, they remained sons and brothers. Farewell letters were gathered and sealed. Some were handed to officers for delivery after the mission. Others were entrusted to comrades who would remain behind. The paper felt thin, fragile beneath the fingers, yet it carried words of immense weight. Many of the men had rewritten their letters several times, discarding drafts until the message felt steady, proper, complete. Each stroke of the brush was deliberate, each phrase shaped with care, for these words would outlive them. The rituals were not purely solemn. In some barracks, the chosen recruits gathered with comrades to share a final meal. Bowls of rice were filled generously, miso soup ladled steaming, pickled vegetables arranged neatly. Jokes were whispered, songs hummed, laughter rising for a moment before fading into silence. These moments were bittersweet, filled with the warmth of friendship, shadowed by the knowledge that it was the last time they would sit together. The night before departure carried a strange stillness. The barracks grew quieter than usual, lanterns dimmed earlier, conversations softened into whispers. Some men slept soundly, their bodies exhausted, their minds emptied by ritual acceptance. Others lay awake staring at the ceiling, hands resting on folded headbands, listening to the faint rustle of wind outside. In that stillness, memories rose unbidden, faces of parents, voices of siblings, fields and rivers of home. For a few hours, they returned to those places in their thoughts, holding them close before dawn came to take them away. At sunrise, the final procession began. The recruits marched in formation toward the airfield, headbands tied, eyes steady. Officers and instructors stood at attention, their salutes sharp, their expressions unreadable. The air was filled with the low hum of engines warming, the smell of fuel thick and sharp. Families were not present, for this was not a farewell of relatives but of soldiers. The nation itself was meant to be the witness. Before climbing into the cockpits, the recruits paused for one last ritual. They bowed deeply toward the portrait of the Emperor displayed near the runway. The bow was long, deliberate, an act of surrender and devotion. For many, it was the final gesture of their lives on Earth. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant call of birds and the steady thrum of engines waiting. The ritual of departure transformed fear into formality, doubt into discipline. It gave the men a framework within which to carry their final hours. By drinking the sake, by tying the headband, by bowing before the Emperor, they stepped into roles larger than themselves. They became not merely individuals but symbols, their lives woven into the fabric of the nation's story. And yet, beneath the layers of ritual, the silent struggle continued. Each man still carried his private thoughts, his hidden fears, his longing for life. But the rituals allowed those feelings to be contained, shaped into gestures that conveyed honor rather than weakness. They gave the recruits a way to walk calmly toward death, their faces serene, their hearts trembling in silence. By the time the planes roared down the runway, the rituals had done their work. The recruits no longer appeared as boys pulled too soon from villages and schools. They appeared as warriors, resolved and steady, carrying the weight of their mission with quiet dignity. The rituals had wrapped them in honor, lifted them into legend, and set them on the path from which there was no return. Part 11. The Night Before. The night before the final mission was unlike any other. Training, drills, and ceremonies had shaped the body and sharpened the mind, but as dusk settled over the airfield, a hush descended that could not be commanded away. It was a stillness filled with unspoken thoughts, a weight that pressed gently but firmly on every breath. The chosen recruits knew that when the sun rose again, their lives would narrow to a single flight, a single dive, a single instant that would end in fire. The barracks that evening carried a quiet rhythm. Lanterns glowed faintly, their light softened by the smoke of oil wicks. Mats were laid neatly in rows, boots lined with precision, uniforms folded for the last time. The air smelled of wood and straw, mixed with the lingering tang of fuel carried in from the runways. Outside, the hum of engines testing in the distance was a reminder of what awaited at dawn. Meals were served as usual, bowls of rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables, but the atmosphere was different. Some recruits ate slowly, savoring each grain of rice as though trying to carve its taste into memory. Others finished quickly, their hands trembling slightly as they set their bowls aside. Conversation was sparse, broken by moments of faint laughter that rose like sparks before fading into silence again. Each man carried his own way of marking the evening, but all felt the same gravity. Letters were written one last time. The chosen recruits leaned over their paper with brushes in hand, the strokes deliberate and steady. These were not routine reassurances, nor simple updates about training. They were farewells, shaped carefully so that families would feel pride rather than sorrow. "I go gladly for the Emperor," one might write. "Please do not grieve. Remember me with honor." The words concealed the tremor of the hand, the ache of the heart, the longing for home that grew sharper as night deepened. When the letters were finished, they were sealed with precision and placed neatly for collection. Some men pressed the envelopes briefly to their foreheads, a silent blessing, a whispered prayer. Others tucked them into sleeves or pockets, reluctant to part with them, as though still clinging to the bond of ink and paper that tied them to their families. Afterward came the quiet rituals of preparation. Headbands were folded neatly, to be tied at dawn. Goggles were polished, straps adjusted, uniforms brushed clean. These tasks were done slowly, not from laziness but from a need to stretch the hours, to fill the silence with action. Each small gesture became significant: the tightening of a strap, the smoothing of fabric, the careful placing of boots by the mat. In these details, the recruits found a fragile sense of control over a future that no longer belonged to them. Some gathered in small groups, singing softly the songs of their youth. The melodies were familiar, carrying echoes of summer festivals, of schoolyards, of evenings by firelight. Their voices were low, almost whispers, yet the harmonies filled the barracks with warmth. For a moment, they were no longer soldiers bound for death, but boys again, remembering laughter, remembering home. The songs faded gently into silence, leaving behind a quiet that seemed even heavier. Others prayed. Kneeling beside their mats, hands pressed together, eyes closed, they whispered words to ancestors, to gods, to the Emperor himself. Some prayed for courage, others for forgiveness, others for the strength to carry out their mission without hesitation. The prayers rose like threads of smoke, unseen but deeply felt, filling the room with a sense of solemn connection. Sleep did not come easily. The body was exhausted from drills, from ceremonies, from the endless rhythm of training, but the mind resisted rest. Eyes stared at the beams of the ceiling, ears caught the faint sounds of wind outside, hearts beat loudly in the stillness. Dreams came fitfully, filled with images of clouds, of ocean waves, of fire. Some awoke with a start, breathing heavily, before lying back down and forcing their bodies still again. Yet for a few, sleep came gently, as if acceptance had wrapped them in quiet. Their breathing slowed, their faces softened, and they drifted into slumber without struggle. Whether this was courage or surrender, none could say. In the morning, all would rise together, the sleepers and the restless alike, bound by the same destiny. The night stretched long, but eventually the sky outside began to pale. The lanterns flickered lower, the air cooled, and silence deepened one last time. Each man lay knowing that the next sound they heard would be the call to rise, to dress, to march, to fly. The night before had done its work. It had given them space to remember, to pray, to struggle in silence, to prepare in small ways. And when dawn came, they would stand not as boys in waiting, but as men marked for their final journey. Part 12. Final Goodbyes. The morning of departure carried a stillness unlike any other. The chosen recruits rose before the sun, their bodies moving through familiar routines with quiet precision. Mats were rolled, uniforms adjusted, boots tied firmly. Yet each motion felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that these small acts of order were the last they would perform in life. The barracks smelled faintly of straw and oil, but beneath those scents lingered something intangible, the awareness of endings. Before stepping onto the airfield, each man prepared his farewell. These goodbyes were not spoken aloud to family, for relatives were far away in villages and cities, unaware that this day would claim their sons. Instead, the goodbyes were carried out through ritual, through letters, through the stillness of bowed heads and the steady silence of comrades who watched them go. The farewell letters written the night before were gathered carefully, sealed and stacked by officers who would deliver them after the mission. For the recruits, placing those envelopes into the hands of another was a final act of letting go. In those folded sheets of paper lived the voices they could no longer share, the touches they could no longer give, the memories they hoped their families would carry forever. Each recruit lingered as he handed his envelope over, eyes lowered, lips pressed together, the gesture lasting longer than the officers expected. Afterward came the final assembly. The chosen men stood in a line, their white headbands tied firmly, the red circle of the rising sun resting above their brows. Their comrades, those who would remain behind, gathered to watch. The air was thick with silence. Some men offered bows, others words of encouragement, a few simple touches to shoulders or arms. These were not dramatic farewells, but quiet acknowledgments of bonds forged through months of training. No one spoke of death directly, but every man knew the truth. One by one, the chosen recruits were given small tokens. A cup of sake was lifted, sipped, and set down again. The taste burned slightly on the tongue, warming the chest for a brief moment. It was a final toast, not to life, but to courage. A photograph of the emperor was presented, and each recruit bowed deeply before it, his forehead nearly touching the floor. This act sealed the farewell, not only to family and friends, but to life itself. For some, a final goodbye came in prayer. Kneeling briefly beside the runway, hands pressed together, eyes closed, they whispered words to ancestors, to gods, to the spirits that guided them. The prayers varied, but their essence was the same: gratitude for life, hope for courage, and pleas for families left behind. These whispered words rose into the morning air, unseen but heavy with emotion. As the time to depart drew near, comrades stepped forward one last time. They offered bows deeper than any given before, their eyes lowered in respect. Some clasped hands briefly, the touch firm, filled with unspoken words. A few spoke quietly, "Do your duty well, or we will remember you." The chosen recruits responded with calm voices, though inside their hearts ached with longing. These were the last human connections they would feel, the last exchanges of warmth before the engines roared. The officers watched solemnly, their expressions unreadable. They had performed this ritual many times before, but it never grew lighter. Behind their stern faces lay the knowledge that they were sending boys to certain death, boys who smiled bravely while carrying fear within. Yet they upheld the ritual, for it gave structure to grief, dignity to sacrifice, and order to the chaos of war. Finally, the chosen recruits walked toward their planes. The airfield stretched wide before them, engines already rumbling, propellers spinning slowly in preparation. The smell of fuel was strong, the vibration of machinery steady beneath the feet. Each step across the ground felt deliberate, as though the earth itself marked their passage. Their shadows stretched long in the rising light, dark shapes moving toward the machines that would carry them into eternity. Before climbing into the cockpits, many paused for one last glance at the horizon. The sky was pale, painted with the first hues of dawn. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the roar of engines. The recruits breathed deeply, filling their lungs with morning air, knowing it would be their last. Some smiled faintly, others bowed their heads, but all carried within them the quiet knowledge that this was the end. The final goodbyes were not dramatic. They were not shouted or wept in public. They lived in the stillness of gestures, in the press of a hand against a comrade's arm, in the bow of the head before a portrait, in the careful sealing of a letter. They were acts of restraint, shaped by discipline, yet no less powerful for their quiet. Through these goodbyes, the recruits honored their families, their comrades, their nation, and themselves. When at last they climbed into their planes and tightened the straps across their chests, the goodbyes lingered in their hearts. The letters, the bows, the touches, the prayers, they were carried into the cockpit, into the sky, into the final dive. These goodbyes gave meaning to what awaited, transforming fear into resolve, sorrow into dignity, endings into memory. And as the engines roared louder, lifting the planes down the runway, the final goodbyes became part of the wind. They were carried upward, across fields and villages, across seas and skies, returning silently to the families who still slept in distant homes. The recruits did not speak them aloud, but the goodbyes traveled nonetheless, reaching the hearts that would one day read their letters, weep over their absence, and remember their names. Within the cockpit, time seemed to bend. Minutes stretched endlessly as he waited for the signal, yet each second also passed too quickly, carrying him closer to inevitability. Sweat gathered on his forehead, sliding beneath the edge of his headband. His mouth was dry, his hands damp on the controls. He forced his breathing steady, inhaling the sharp air of fuel and oil, exhaling slowly, again and again, as if each breath was a prayer. When the signal came, it was not dramatic. A hand lifted, a flag waved, the instructors stepped back. The recruit pressed the throttle forward, the engine roared, the plane shuddered and began to roll. The runway blurred beneath the wheels, vibrations rattling teeth and bones. The stick pulled back, the nose lifted, and suddenly the ground fell away. The cockpit transformed once more. The earth shrank beneath him, the barracks and fields reduced to tiny shapes. The sky opened wide, vast and endless. Wind tore past the canopy, the roar of the engine filled his ears, and the vibrations of the frame matched the pounding of his heart. In that moment, he was both utterly trapped and completely free, bound tightly within the harness, yet soaring higher than he had ever dreamed. And yet, in those moments above the earth, there was a strange peace. The cockpit shielded him from the world, wrapped him in metal and sound, carried him above the land he loved. Below stretched fields, rivers, villages, everything he sought to protect, everything he longed to return to. Above stretched the endless sky, a canvas of color and light. Between them sat the recruit, alone in his cockpit, caught between life and death, duty and longing, fear and resolve. The cockpit was not simply a machine's chamber. It was a shrine, a place where memory, loyalty, and mortality converged. A place where the human heart beat against steel, where final thoughts echoed louder than the roar of engines, where a young man carried everything he was into the sky. Part 13. The Cockpit. The cockpit was the final threshold between life and death. It was not simply a seat of metal and glass, but a chamber where a young man confronted the immensity of his fate. From the outside, the aircraft seemed an instrument of war, propeller spinning, fuselage gleaming in the morning light. But inside, the cockpit became a solitary space, closing in around him until nothing existed except his body, his thoughts, and the sky. Climbing into the cockpit was a ritual in itself. The recruit placed his hand on the cool edge of the fuselage, lifted one boot to the step, and swung himself carefully into the narrow seat. The leather straps of the harness hung waiting, and as he pulled them across his chest, the embrace was both protective and suffocating. Buckle by buckle, he bound himself to the machine, surrendering the freedom of his own body. Once secured, there was no easy way out. The seat was tight, the edges pressing into his hips, the back hard against his spine. Dials and switches filled the small panel before him, their markings familiar from endless hours in the classroom. Altimeter, compass, throttle, fuel gauge, each one a reminder of lessons memorized, of corrections barked, of diagrams sketched in fading ink. His hands moved instinctively to check them, though he already knew the motions by heart. The cockpit had been designed to leave no room for hesitation. The smell was sharp and overwhelming. Oil, gasoline, and metal combined in a scent that clung to skin and clothing. It filled his lungs with every breath, a reminder that the machine was alive around him. The vibrations of the engine testing on the runway shook the frame, rattling the pedals beneath his feet, humming through the stick in his hands. Each vibration traveled into his bones, until his own heartbeat seemed to match the rhythm of the machine. The canopy above let in the light of dawn. The horizon stretched in pale colors, soft blues and pinks painted across the sky. Yet from within the cockpit, the beauty of the morning felt distant, framed by metal edges and the looming shape of the propeller. The world outside seemed both vast and unreachable. In those moments before takeoff, thoughts rushed unbidden. A mother's voice calling him in for supper, the laughter of a younger sister, the steady presence of a father who rarely spoke but always guided. A cherry tree blooming in spring, the sound of a festival drum, the taste of warm rice at home. These memories flickered quickly, too quick to linger, yet sharp enough to pierce the heart. He tightened his grip on the stick, steadying himself, forcing the mask of composure back into place. Instructors moved along the line of aircraft, their gestures firm, their eyes sharp. They shouted brief commands, checked straps, tapped gauges, adjusted headbands. To them, the cockpit was a tool, the recruit inside an extension of the state's will. Yet even the instructors lingered for a moment longer than usual, their voices quieter, their movements slower. They, too, knew what awaited these young men. The recruit adjusted his goggles, the glass cool against his skin. He tested the pedals with his boots, felt the resistance beneath them, pressed the throttle slightly and heard the engine roar louder in response. The vibrations increased, the noise deafening, drowning out all but the strongest thoughts. The machine was awake, restless, demanding action. A glance to the side revealed the faces of comrades in other cockpits. Their expressions were calm, their eyes hidden behind goggles, their bodies steady in the harnesses. Yet the recruit knew that inside each of them, the same storm raged, the same memories, the same fear, the same effort to hold steady against the weight of destiny. A brief nod exchanged across the line was enough. Words were unnecessary. The cockpit was too loud, and the moment too final. He knew this was not an ordinary flight. The cockpit was no longer a place of training, no longer a classroom brought to life. It was the stage of his final act. Every switch, every gauge, every vibration carried the knowledge that the machine was not built to carry him home. It was built to carry him into death. Part 14. Impact. The sky stretched wide, endless, and pale, as the planes moved steadily toward their targets. The chosen recruits sat bound within their cockpits, the roar of engines filling every corner of their bodies. Beneath them lay the vast ocean, shimmering with light, carrying the silhouettes of enemy ships. Each mile closed the distance between youth and eternity, between the life they had lived and the moment of fire that awaited them. The dive began not with a sudden command, but with a quiet decision. Each pilot knew when the time had come. The target grew larger below, the ships moving slowly through the water like dark shadows across glass. The heart pounded, faster than the propeller spinning before them. Fingers tightened on the stick, eyes fixed on the horizon one last time. Then the nose tilted downward, and gravity claimed the machine. The dive was violent. The cockpit rattled, the frame groaned, the wind howled louder than thought itself. The earth rushed upward, the ocean's surface expanding rapidly, the enemy ships sharpening into clear detail. The pilot's body pressed hard against the harness, lungs straining, vision narrowing. Sweat blurred the goggles, but there was no time to wipe it away. Every second carried him closer to destiny. In that plunge, memories returned in flashes, faster than the eye could follow. The face of a mother bent over a stove, the sound of a father's sandals on a wooden floor, the laughter of siblings running in fields, the quiet beauty of cherry blossoms falling in spring. The cockpit became a gallery of memory, images rising and vanishing in the space of heartbeats. The past surged forward, not as regret but as farewell. Some pilots prayed aloud, their voices swallowed by the roar of the engine. Others whispered nothing, their silence as heavy as the rushing air. A few shouted, not words but cries that tore free from the chest, cries of life meeting its end. Each man carried his own final expression, yet all were united by the dive, the shared arc of descent, the shared destiny of collision. The ships below loomed closer. Guns fired upward, tracers streaking through the air, explosions scattering bursts of smoke and flame. The planes shook with the force of near misses, but the dive did not falter. The pilots had trained for this, prepared for this, resigned themselves to this. Their eyes locked on the target, their hands steady on the controls, their bodies pressed hard into the seats as the final seconds rushed upon them. The moment of impact was both instant and eternal. Metal struck metal, fire erupted, the roar of the engine became the roar of destruction. The cockpit ceased to exist, the body ceased to exist, the machine and the man merged into a single flash of violence. For those who watched from the decks below, it was a moment of terror and awe, a streak of death falling from the sky. For the pilot, it was the end of struggle, the closing of a story written in duty and silence. Yet within that instant, there was also release. The body no longer bore the weight of fear, the heart no longer carried the burden of choice. The dive had ended, the mission complete. In that final explosion, the recruit became what he had been trained to be. A sacrifice, an offering, a symbol of devotion carried out to its last breath. The ocean swallowed the wreckage quickly, waves closing over fragments of steel and fire. Smoke rose, carried by the wind, drifting across the sea. The ships below reeled from the strikes, their crews shaken, their decks scarred. But for the pilots, there was no more sky, no more ocean, no more earth. The dive had consumed everything, leaving only memory behind. Those who remained behind, the comrades still training, the officers who gave the orders, the families who would one day receive the letters, felt the impact differently. To comrades, it was a reminder of what awaited them. To officers, it was the execution of duty, one more mission marked as complete. To families, it was a silence that arrived in envelopes, a grief wrapped in words of honor. The impact was not only physical. It echoed through the hearts of those left living. It was felt in the empty space at mealtimes in the barracks, in the quiet after songs once sung together, in the folded letters read and reread by mothers and fathers in faraway villages. It was the absence that filled every corner, the unspoken truth that lingered long after the explosion had faded from the sea. For the young men themselves, the dive was the final chapter of the silent struggle, the last act of the ritual of departure. It was the moment when body and spirit gave themselves wholly, without turning back. And though history remembers the impact as destruction, it also carries within it the quiet humanity of boys who once walked barefoot in fields, who once laughed with friends, who once dreamed of futures that would never arrive. In the end, the impact was not only collision but transformation. From flesh into memory, from fear into legend, from youth into eternal story. The cockpit was empty, the body gone, but the sacrifice lingered in the air, carried by the wind, etched into the hearts of those who remembered. Part 15. Aftermath and Memory. The roar of engines faded. The smoke cleared from the sea. Waves closed quickly over twisted fragments of steel, swallowing them into silence. For the men who had gone into the dive, there was nothing more to hear or see. Their struggle, their fear, their courage, their memories, all had ended in a single moment of fire. But for those who remained, the aftermath began. It stretched far beyond the airfields and oceans, reaching into the barracks, into the homes of villages, into the very heart of the nation. Back at the airfields, comrades stood in formation, their faces steady but their eyes shadowed. They had watched friends walk out in headbands and harnesses, had seen them climb into cockpits, had heard the thunder of departure. Now, the empty mats in the barracks spoke louder than any speech. At mealtime, bowls remained unclaimed. At night, voices that once joined in song were missing. The silence of absence filled the rooms, heavy and unrelenting. Instructors carried themselves with stern composure, their words sharp as ever, their commands delivered without tremor. Yet beneath their voices lingered the knowledge that they had trained boys to walk calmly into death. Some instructors hardened further, insisting that the fallen had achieved eternal glory, that their comrades must be ready to do the same. Others softened in rare, quiet moments, pausing longer when passing empty spaces, letting their gaze rest for a heartbeat too long before moving on. They, too, carried the weight of the aftermath. For families, the news came not with ceremony but with envelopes. A knock at the door, a uniformed man bowing deeply, a letter handed with both hands. Mothers unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, their eyes scanning words of honor. Your son has given his life for the emperor. His spirit is eternal. His sacrifice will never be forgotten. Fathers read in silence, their jaws clenched, their shoulders rigid, their grief hidden behind restraint. Sisters and brothers cried openly, clutching the letter as though it were a piece of the brother who would never return. The farewell letters written by the recruits arrived in these same envelopes, delivered alongside the official words of the state. Mothers read them again and again, tracing each brushstroke as if touching the son himself. Some letters spoke with pride, others with gentle encouragement, all with a quiet tenderness hidden behind formality. Families often sense the truths beneath the surface, the longing, the regret, the unspoken farewell, and in those truths, their grief deepened. Yet they clung to the letters, for they were the last voices left. In villages, the news spread quickly. Neighbors came with bowed heads, offering condolences, bringing food, sharing silence. The family's name was spoken with respect, the sacrifice praised, the memory of the young man carried in whispers. Yet behind the public pride lived private sorrow. Mothers wept at night when no one could see. Fathers stood alone in fields, staring into distance, their hands tightening on tools that suddenly felt heavy. Brothers and sisters dreamed of reunions that would never come. The nation honored the fallen with monuments and ceremonies. Names were carved into stone, photographs displayed in halls of remembrance, songs sung in their memory. The newspapers praised their courage, their images printed beneath bold headlines. The emperor himself was invoked as the one who had received their offering, their lives folded into the myth of eternal devotion. For the state, the aftermath was not only grief but narrative. Each death became part of a story told to inspire the next. Yet for the comrades who remained, the aftermath was personal. They remembered the laughter shared in waiting rooms, the whispered jokes in barracks, the trembling hands that gripped brushes while writing letters. They remembered the small tokens tucked into pockets, the quiet prayers whispered before dawn, the final nods exchanged across cockpits. The state spoke of symbols, but comrades remembered faces, voices, gestures. For them, the fallen were not only heroes but friends. Time did not erase the memory. Years later, families still opened the letters, still touched the ink, still spoke the names softly into the night. Comrades who survived carried the images of their friends into old age, the memories of barracks and cockpits never fading. The silence of the waiting rooms, the weight of the final night, the roar of the dive. These echoes lived on inside them, reminders of youth cut short, of duty carried out, of humanity hidden behind symbols. The aftermath was not only grief, but legacy. The fallen were remembered in prayers, in festivals, in family shrines. Their photographs stood framed on household altars, incense rising before them, offerings of food and flowers placed at their side. Their names were spoken each year, keeping them alive in memory even as decades passed. They had become spirits in the eyes of their families, guardians watching from beyond, eternal in presence if not in flesh. And so the story of the Kamikaze pilots did not end with impact. It continued in the silence of barracks, in the sorrow of families, in the reverence of a nation, and in the memories carried by those who lived on. The aftermath stretched across time, shaping not only the history of a war but the lives of all who touched it. The memory of the young men remained layered, symbols of sacrifice to the state, sources of grief to their families, companions in memory to their comrades. They were boys who had once laughed under summer skies, who had once dreamed of futures never lived, who had once written letters filled with words they dared not speak aloud. And in the quiet spaces of memory, there remained not only warriors, but sons, brothers, friends, human beings caught in the vast machinery of war. The waves closed over the wreckage, the engines fell silent, the smoke drifted away. But the memory endured, carried in ink and stone, in whispers and prayers, in silence and in song. The aftermath was grief, but it was also remembrance. And in that remembrance, the young men lived on, forever tied to the sky, forever bound to the horizon, forever remembered by those who loved them.